The Texas sun was a brutal, unforgiving fire that afternoon, scorching everything it touched, including the back of Thaddeus Bear Mallister as he mended a splintered fence post near the creek. At 34, Bear was no stranger to the hardships of ranch life. Cattle rustlers, droughts, coyotes, he'd faced them all with quiet grit. But nothing prepared him for the sight that appeared across the open prairie that day. A small figure, no taller than a fence rail, was stumbling across the sun-baked earth toward his water source. At first, Bear thought it was a mirage heat playing tricks on his eyes. But as the figure drew closer, the truth became clearer. A child, alone, barefoot, dressed in tattered garments that once held ceremonial significance, now barely holding together. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. Her steps were erratic, weak, as if each one required more strength than she had left. Bear dropped his tools instincts kicking in. Most ranchers in this part of Texas would have reached for their rifle first. Relations between settlers and the Comanche had soured into something near open war. Raids and retribution had bled both sides. Mercy was rare suspicion constant. But Bear had never fit the mold of the men around him. He walked slowly towards her, hands visible, making no sudden movements. She saw him coming, but didn't run. Maybe she couldn't. When he finally closed the distance, he saw her face, sunburned lips, cracked eyes too big for the thinness of her cheeks. She looked up at him, and Bear felt something in his chest twist. She said something in Comanche, fast, urgent, but he couldn't understand. Still, her message was painfully clear. She cupped her small hands to her mouth, then pointed to the creek. Hunger, thirst, desperation. Bear hesitated. His mind flashed through every warning he'd ever heard. Don't get involved. Don't invite trouble. A Comanche child on a white man's land. It could spark a war. But his gut, the part of him that still remembers what it felt like to lose someone, overruled his fear. Without a word, he knelt and gently lifted the girl into his arms. She didn't resist. She was too weak to. She weighed next to nothing more bone than child, and her body trembled against his chest. Whether from fear or starvation, Bear didn't know. He carried her to his cabin like she was made of glass. Inside, the air was cooler. He set her gently in the only chair he owned and moved to the stove. There was still some venison stew left from the night before, still warm in the pot. He ladled it into a bowl, sliced off a piece of bread, and set it in front of her. The smell seemed to revive her. She sat up straight, her eyes lighting up with a flicker of something he hadn't seen before, hope. She devoured the food with a hunger that made Bear look away. That's when he saw it, something peeking from beneath the collar of her torn dress. A necklace. Not just any necklace. Bear's heart dropped. Intricate beadwork, unmistakable in its design. Just a week ago, old Pete Morrison had described that exact pattern beads worn only by the family of Chief White Bull, the most feared and respected Comanche leader in the territory. Bear froze. His hand hovered over the stew pot bowl still half full. This wasn't just any child. She was his daughter. And now Bear realized he wasn't just feeding a hungry girl. He had unknowingly taken in the most valuable and most dangerous child in all of Comanche country. And her people were surely looking for her. The girl's bowl was nearly empty now, save for a thin trail of stew clinging to the rim. Her tiny hands trembled as she brought the last piece of bread to her cracked lips, chewing slowly as though afraid the moment of safety would disappear if she rushed. Bear stood a few paces away, arms crossed, watching her in silence. He wasn't sure what unsettled him more, how starved she was, or how easily he'd broken every unspoken law of survival in these parts just to help her. Then, as she adjusted in the chair, her collar slipped lower. Bear's eyes narrowed. A delicate necklace hung around her neck, beaded in brilliant red, white, and deep blue, threaded with small silver discs and eagle feathers. The pattern was unmistakable. Bear's blood ran cold. Just days ago, old Pete Morrison had described that exact design around a campfire at the trading post ceremonial beads he'd said reserved only for the bloodline of Chief White Bull. Chief White Bull. A name spoken with equal parts fear and respect across all of northern Texas. He was a legend, some said more spirit than man, who had never lost a battle, never forgotten a slight, and never forgiven a white settler for anything. Bear had never seen him, but he'd seen what was left behind in the wake of White Bull's justice, smoldering ranches, broken fences, and men who vanished into the plains without a trace. Now, Bear stood face to face with the chief's daughter, and she was asleep in his cabin wearing his blanket with stew on her lips. Panic gripped his chest. He took a slow step back, heart pounding against his ribs. What if someone had seen her enter the ranch? What if scouts were already watching from the tree line, mistaking kindness for kidnapping? Bear considered waking her, demanding to know how she'd ended up alone on the prairie. But one look at her fragile frame, curled up in the chair like a stray pup, stopped him cold. Whatever had happened to bring her here, it hadn't been easy. And if she really was White Bull's only daughter, then he wasn't just harboring a lost child. He was harboring a symbol of tribal power, a symbol whose disappearance could ignite a war. Bear moved to the window, pushing back the curtain to scan the horizon. Nothing. Just rolling hills and scorched grass. But the silence outside felt too heavy, like the land itself was holding its breath. He couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching, waiting. He turned back to the girl. She stirred slightly in the chair, murmuring something in Comanche as she clutched the edge of his blanket. Her lips formed a name in her sleep, Tasunke, the Comanche word for horse, but spoken with the affection of a child calling for her companion. Maybe a lost pony, or maybe someone who'd never come back. Bear exhaled slowly. He knew what the right thing was, what the smart thing was. Turn her over to the sheriff. Let the town handle it. Let someone else ride out to the Comanche lands and pray they didn't come back angry. But deep down, Bear knew no one else would treat her with care. He also knew that if word got out before he acted, they wouldn't ask questions. They'd string him up for kidnapping and blame him for whatever vengeance followed. Suddenly, a sound snapped through the air like a gunshot, a distant rhythmic pounding. Faint but unmistakable. War drums. Bear froze. Not raiders, not thieves. This was something worse. This was a call to arms. The girl jolted awake, her eyes wide. She heard it, too. She looked at Bear, and for the first time since he'd found her there was fear in her gaze. Real fear, not of him, but of what was coming. She jumped down from the chair and ran to the window, pointing toward the distant hills. Then she turned back to him, holding up both hands, opening and closing her fingers rapidly. Bear counted aloud, stunned as her small hands moved with increasing urgency. 10, 20, 30, 50, 70, 100. She kept going. When she finally stopped, Bear's knees almost gave out. 200. 200 Comanche warriors were on their way, and Bear finally understood he hadn't rescued a child. He had become the unwitting center of a storm no one would survive unless he could prove one thing, that he'd saved her life, not stolen it. And he had very little time to do it. The sun had dipped below the hills, painting the sky in streaks of blood red and ash gray. Shadows stretched long across the dry earth, and the breeze had gone still as if the land itself feared what was coming. Inside his cabin, Bear paced the floor, jaw-clenched heart drumming faster than his boots could move. The girl was asleep again, curled tightly beneath his only blanket. She hadn't spoken since waking up to the sound of distant drums. She didn't need to. Her terrified eyes had said enough. Bear knew she was counting warriors, not just drum beats. And now he knew what was coming. A war party, 200 strong. He hadn't wanted to believe it. But then came the hoofbeats. Not many, just 3. Bear rushed to the window and peered out. 3 riders were approaching, fast, kicking up dust, riding hard. As they neared, he recognized the lead man's broad shoulders and battered hat. Cletus Hartwell, his neighbor. Behind him were Deputy Jake Morrison and Reverend Thomas. Bear stepped outside before they could dismount, trying to keep the noise down, but Cletus was already shouting before his horse even stopped. "Bear, you damned fool. What in God's name are you thinking?" Morrison was already scanning the tree line, one hand on the butt of his rifle. "Smoke signals," he said grimly. "Saw 'em rising from the east hills around midday. My father sent word from town. White Bull's daughter went missing 3 days ago. Disappeared during a hunting trip. Word is she got lost in the storm." He turned toward Bear slowly, his eyes sharp. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about a missing Comanche child, would you?" Bear's mouth went dry. He could lie. He could send them away, say he hadn't seen a thing. But they'd known each other for years. Despite their flaws, they weren't here out of malice. They were trying to help in the only way they knew. "She's inside," Bear said quietly. "Half-starved. Could barely walk. I couldn't let her die." A heavy silence followed. The wind picked up just enough to make the dry grass rustle like whispers in a graveyard. Reverend Thomas was the first to speak. His voice was soft, almost sorrowful. "Son, do you have any idea what you've done?" Bear nodded. "I helped a hungry child." Even as he said it, the words felt naive. Cletus ran a hand through his hair, pacing. "You don't get it, Bear. They're going to think you took her. Hell, they probably already do. White Bulls wiped out entire settlements for less than this." Deputy Morrison swung back into his saddle. "I have to report this. It's my duty. But I'll give you a head start. Try to return her. Find their camp, explain yourself before they find you." Bear looked back toward the cabin. "She's too weak to travel. And even if she could walk, how am I supposed to walk into a Comanche camp at night without catching an arrow between the ribs?" "That's your problem now," Morrison said, tightening the reins. "I'm heading back to town to warn everyone else. If White Bull thinks you've harmed his daughter, he won't just burn your ranch. He'll tear through this whole county." And with that, the riders turned and vanished into the dusk. Bear stood alone, watching the last hints of daylight slip behind the horizon. From inside, the soft sound of the girl's breathing was the only thing grounding him. He considered packing supplies, hitching up the wagon, trying to flee south, but something inside him knew it was useless. They were too many too fast, and running would only make him look guilty. Then he heard it. The drums. Closer now. Rhythmic, measured, not frantic like a raiding party. This was worse. This was organized, ceremonial, a declaration. The Comanche weren't coming to scout. They were coming to judge. Bear rushed back inside. The girl was already sitting up, eyes wide with recognition. She began speaking rapidly in Comanche, pointing toward the door, then back at herself, then at him. He knelt beside her. "I don't know what you're saying, little one, but I think I'm about to find out what it costs to do the right thing." She pulled at his sleeve, then opened and closed her fingers, counting again. 10, 20, 30. Bear's stomach turned. 200. As he peeked out the window, shapes began to materialize in the night. Silent, deliberate, and deadly. Warriors in full paint, spears glinting, bows drawn. They were surrounding the ranch, and Bear knew there was no turning back. Only one path remained. Now stand, speak, and hope the truth would be enough to spare his life. The cabin door creaked open, breaking the heavy silence like a gunshot in church. Bear stepped out slowly, hands raised high above his head, every instinct in his body screaming to duck and run. But he didn't, because running meant guilt, and guilt meant death. The girl followed close behind barefoot and trembling, one tiny hand clutching the hem of his coat. She had insisted on coming, pointing to herself, then to the door, then back at Bear with urgent eyes. Somehow she understood that this moment, this step, had to be taken together. What they faced was not a raiding party. It was an army. 200 Comanche warriors mounted and silent formed a wide crescent around Bear's cabin like a noose tightening with every breath. In the flickering moonlight, their war paint shimmered like blood and bone. Spears and bows gleamed. Eyes burned with fury. At the center of the formation, unmoving, sat the one man Bear knew without ever having met Chief White Bull. Massive. Still. His long black hair streaked with silver. A breastplate made of carved bone adorned his chest, and a long scar cut across his jaw like a brand of war. His expression was unreadable, but his presence radiated raw, dangerous authority. The girl broke free from Bear's side and ran toward the chief, calling out in rapid Comanche. Bear held his breath, expecting a cheer, a rush of relief. But White Bull's face hardened. He dismounted, slow and deliberate, and knelt beside his daughter. His massive hands gently examined her arms, her face, her legs. She spoke urgently, pointing back toward Bear in the cabin. White Bull's jaw tightened. His eyes shifted locked on Bear, and the weight of that gaze nearly dropped him to his knees. The chief rose. Each step he took toward Bear was like thunder rolling over dry earth. He stopped only inches away, close enough for Bear to smell the leather of his armor and the iron of his fury. "My daughter tells me you fed her." White Bull said, his voice low but laced with steel. "Gave her shelter." Bear nodded, forcing himself to meet the man's eyes. "Yes, she was starving. I couldn't let her die." White Bull narrowed his eyes. "She also says you saw the sacred beads." His voice darkened. "You knew who she was, and you still didn't return her." Bear's heart thudded. She was too weak to travel. "I planned to bring her back at first light." The chief's lips twitched, not a smile, but something colder. Or perhaps he said, voice sharpening like a blade you saw an opportunity. "A daughter of White Bull is worth much. Cattle, horses, safe passage through our lands. Did you think to trade her like stolen grain?" The accusation slammed into Bear like a fist. Behind White Bull, the warriors shifted bows, tightening spears, lowering. One wrong word, and they would strike like a storm. "I didn't know who she was," Bear said, voice rough. "Not at first. But once I saw the necklace, I still chose to help her. I never asked her for anything. I just fed her, let her rest. That's all." White Bull studied him for a long, blistering moment. "That is not the story my warriors expect. I don't care what they expect," Bear replied, pulse pounding. "I care what's true." A low murmur rippled through the ranks. Several warriors began shouting in Comanche, angry, sharp, calling for blood. One rode forward, pointing his lance at Bear's chest, shouting loud enough to shake the ground. The girl screamed something and ran back toward Bear, placing herself between him and the rider. Her voice cracked the night air like thunder, desperate, fierce begging. White Bull raised a hand and the war party fell eerily silent again. Then he said, "You will prove your words." Bear's breath caught. How White Bull's gaze didn't waver. "Come with us, to our village. Speak before our elders. Let them see the man who dared touch the blood of White Bull and lived to tell it. If they believe you, you live. And if they don't—" The chief looked toward the warriors, 200 bows still strung, 200 arrows still ready. "Then you will die, and your land will burn with you." The silence that followed White Bull's ultimatum was so absolute, it felt like the earth itself had stopped breathing. Bear stood frozen, 200 warriors still surrounding his cabin like coiled vipers' weapons ready to strike. The little girl stood between him and death, her small chest rising and falling eyes darting between her father and the angry sea of warriors calling for justice. Then, suddenly, she spoke, not with hesitation, not with fear, but with fire. Her voice rang out in Comanche, small yet sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife through leather. She turned to face the warriors, her hands moving with urgency as she pointed to Bear, to herself, then back toward the cabin. Her words came fast, her tone passionate. Bear couldn't understand the language, but the meaning poured from her like a flood of truth. She was defending him. The same girl who had once stumbled toward his water source half dead from hunger now stood in the center of a war party defending a white man to her people. White Bull looked at her clearly surprised. His stern face cracked not with softness but with uncertainty. She kept talking, her voice growing louder. She mimed the moment Bear picked her up, how he carried her, how he fed her. Then she pointed toward the cabin and motioned sleeping, then wrapped her arms around herself, showing how he'd given her warmth. Not harm, not threats, only kindness. The warriors murmured, still skeptical. Then, with a quick turn, the girl darted into Bear's cabin. White Bull's eyes narrowed and 2 warriors moved to follow, but the chief raised his hand, let her act. Moments later she reappeared cradling something in her hands. It was a small worn photograph. Bear recognized it immediately, the only photo he had left of his family. His wife and son, both long gone, taken by a cholera outbreak 3 years earlier. The edges were bent from handling and dried prairie flowers still pressed into the corners. The girl ran to her father, held it up, and spoke again, this time slower, her voice quieter. She pointed at the woman in the picture, then to herself, then at the boy, then at Bear. She was saying he lost too. White Bull took the photo. For a long time he stared at the faces, at the grief captured in black and white. Then, without a word, he handed the photo back to Bear, who held it like a sacred relic. She says, White Bull began slowly, "You looked at this picture every night. That you spoke no words, but she saw the pain in your eyes. She says you didn't see a Comanche child. You saw a child, lost alone, like your own had been." Bear's voice caught in his throat. That's the truth. Another murmur passed through the warriors. Less anger now, more curiosity, a shift. Then, from among the ranks, Broken Arrow stepped forward, face painted in crimson, eyes hard as flint. He had been the loudest voice calling for blood. Now he raised his spear again. He shouted something at the girl, loud and guttural. The others stiffened. White Bull translated quietly. He asks her why she defends the Wasatchew, the white man, why she protects the enemy. The girl turned her eyes burning with purpose. She stepped toward Broken Arrow and replied with such intensity that several warriors drew back in surprise. Her hands gestured, her voice trembled, but not from fear, from truth. Her words came like arrows of their own, piercing the quiet. She asks if he has children, White Bull translated. She asks what he would want a stranger to do if his son was starving and lost on the plains. She asks if kindness should be punished or remembered. Broken Arrow's spear lowered. Still, the tension clung to the air. "She's not done," White Bull added. The girl now addressed the entire war party. She raised the photograph above her head and pointed to Bear, then to her heart, then to the warriors, then to the sky. She says White Bull's voice now wavered with emotion. "If we kill a man for kindness, we become what the white man fears us to be, monsters without mercy." She says if we dishonor mercy, then we do not deserve it ourselves. Silence fell again, not hostile, not violent, but reverent. The power of her words had cracked something ancient, something bitter. And as the warriors looked at her, not as a daughter of a chief, but as a truth-teller, something began to change. Respect. She stepped back beside Bear, placed the photo on the porch gently, and looked up at her father. And for the first time that night, White Bull did not look like a warrior. He looked like a father. The night air grew thick with tension, the kind that coils around the lungs and refuses to let go. The girl's brave words still echoed in the minds of the Comanche warriors, but the silence that followed was short-lived. A single voice shattered it, furious, booming, and unwavering. Broken Arrow. He stepped forward, taller than most, his face streaked with crimson paint, the spear in his hand shaking not from fear, but from fury. His glare bore straight into Bear's chest like a dagger made of fire. He shouted in Comanche, his voice rising above the murmurs commanding attention. The other warriors turned toward him instinctively. He was a respected warrior known for leading brutal charges for surviving battles others didn't. And his rage tonight wasn't just personal, it was ancestral. White Bull's jaw tensed. "He demands justice," the chief translated grimly. "He says the old law must be honored blood for blood. He believes your touch alone dishonors her. He believes no white man can help a Comanche child without selfish motives." Broken Arrow's next words came like war drums pounding rhythmic, merciless. He says, "If I do not punish you," White Bull continued, "then I show weakness, and the tribe will no longer follow me." Bear didn't move. He knew this wasn't just about him. It was about a battle between the past and the future, about whether mercy had a place in a world where pain had carved the rules. Then something happened. The girl stepped forward again, smaller than everyone, quieter than the war, but stronger than fear. She stood between Bear and Broken Arrow, her voice soft but unwavering. She began to speak, not in desperation this time, but with reason, with power, with truth. She didn't shout, she didn't plead, she explained. She speaks of what she saw in this man. White Bull translated, struggling to keep up with her words. How he carried her, fed her, gave her warmth when no one else was near. She says he never asked her name, never touched her necklace, never spoke a word that made her feel like property. The warriors watched in silence as the girl paced slowly between Bear and Broken Arrow, like a peacemaker walking the line between war and hope. Her voice remained steady. She says, White Bull continued, that warriors are not men who punish mercy. True warriors protect the weak even when it is inconvenient. She says, punishing kindness would make us no better than those who killed our people without mercy. Broken Arrow flinched not visibly, but in his eyes. Still, he wasn't done. He shouted back at her words like arrows, harsh, bitter, unforgiving. She asks him, White Bull translated if he remembers his own son. The one who died in the last cavalry raid. She asks what he would have wanted if a white man had found his boy bleeding in the dirt. Would he have prayed for a bullet or a blanket? Those words hit deeper than any spear. For a long, excruciating moment, Broken Arrow said nothing. Then he turned to the rest of the warriors, his face torn between pride and something unfamiliar doubt. He dropped the point of his spear slightly. The shift was subtle, but monumental. Some of his loyal followers, once tense and ready to strike, now looked to the girl with new eyes, as if they'd forgotten she was just a child and were beginning to see her for what she truly was. A voice that cut through generations of anger. She says White Bull's voice dropped almost reverent now that vengeance is easy. But justice, real justice, requires understanding. A breeze swept across the prairie, and for the first time that night, it didn't carry the scent of blood, but the whisper of change. The warriors didn't lower their weapons all at once, but the line was no longer drawn in blood. It was being redrawn by the courage of a child. And Bear realized in that moment he wasn't just being protected. He was witnessing something far greater than his own salvation. He was watching a tribe wrestle with its soul. They rode through the dead of night, lit only by the flickering glow of torches and the silver wash of moonlight. Bear sat on a borrowed horse, flanked by warriors on both sides, not as a prisoner, but not yet free. The girl rode just ahead of him, nestled in front of White Bull, her small hands gripping the saddle horn, her eyes locked forward. The air was cold, still, but every hoofbeat echoed with the weight of judgment. Bear had never seen the lands they passed through, hidden valleys, winding ravines, narrow deer trails lost to time. No settler had ever been this deep into Comanche territory and returned to speak of it. And now, here he was, not by force, but by a decision made in the shadow of mercy and war. 3 hours later, they crested a ridge, and the Comanche village unfolded below them like a secret drawn in firelight. Dozens of teepees stood in a perfect crescent. Smoke curled from their tops. Children peeked from flaps. Dogs barked and then fell silent. Word had traveled fast. A white man had entered their sacred ground alive. The war party dismounted in a large circle near the center fire. Bear was led to the middle, where 7 elders waited in silence, seated like weathered statues. Their eyes were hard, ancient, piercing. They had seen entire generations die by bullets and broken treaties. They had no reason to forgive and even less to forget. White Bull spoke first. He relayed the entire account. How Bear had found the girl, how he could have left her to die, how he fed her, protected her, risked his own life. His voice was steady but carried the weight of uncertainty. Then came Broken Arrow, still smoldering but quieter now. He argued for the old ways. He reminded them of all the lies, the broken promises, the graves. Bear stood still, saying nothing. Words would mean little here. Then the girl stepped forward for the 3rd time that night, barefoot, covered in dust but blazing with purpose. She spoke clearly, firmly, directly to the elders. She is telling them, White Bull translated softly, that you are not like the others, that your hands fed her, that your roof sheltered her, that your soul carries the same loss ours does. Bear watched the girl lift the photograph again. His wife, his son, their faces staring out into a circle of men who'd buried too many of their own. She explained what that picture meant. That grief had no color. That pain didn't wear uniforms. She says White Bull added, voice shaken, you would do it again. That if another child came to you, starving, wounded, lost, you would help, even if it meant your own death. The elders did not respond at first. One of them, his hair completely white, his face carved with time, leaned forward and spoke a single sentence. The others nodded. White Bull turned to Bear. "He asks her one question," the chief said. "Do you believe this man would bleed for our people?" The girl didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said. In broken English, he already did. Silence. Then the white-haired elder rose slowly to his feet. His voice was thin but carried like thunder across the circle. White Bull translated. He says, "The spirits did not send us prey tonight. They sent us a test, not of strength but of mercy." Bear's heart thudded in his chest. "You will not die," White Bull continued. "More than that, you will never be hunted by our people again." Bear blinked. "What you are granted eternal protection by the tribe, White Bull," said, meeting his eyes. "Any Comanche who harms you or your land will answer to us." Bear staggered slightly under the weight of those words. The girl smiled a real bright smile and ran to his side, grabbing his hand. The oldest elder added one final condition. White Bull looked at Bear solemnly. "If any of our people ever come to you in need, hunger, injury, fear, you must offer them the same mercy you showed her, no matter who they are." Bear didn't hesitate. "I promise." The circle remained quiet, but in the shadows the shape of something ancient began to change. A bridge had been built not with words but with actions, and in the center of it stood a man who had simply fed a hungry child. The sun rose over the Comanche village like a blessing, soft gold spilling across the plains, chasing away the darkness of the night before. Bear rode out not as a captive, but as something far rarer, a man accepted by both worlds. The girl sat beside him on the horse, no longer silent or afraid. Her head rested lightly against his arm as they passed through the land that had once whispered of death, but now hummed with the quiet possibility of peace. When Bear returned to his ranch, it was untouched, a miracle, considering how close it had come to being reduced to ash. The warriors who escorted him back rode in complete silence, forming a protective arc around his land. Before leaving, one of them drove a single spear into the ground at the edge of his property, wrapped in sacred cloth marked with White Bull's own emblem. It was a warning and a promise. Any man, Comanche or settler, who crossed that line with harm in their heart would answer to the tribe. Word spread faster than wildfire through the surrounding counties. Some settlers were furious, others were afraid, but most were simply stunned. Bear Mallister, the quiet, broad-shouldered rancher who rarely came to town, was now under Comanche protection. But Bear didn't use that protection to isolate himself. Instead, he did something no one expected. He opened his gates, not just to the Comanche, but to anyone willing to sit at the same table, ranchers, traders, scouts, warriors, mothers, and children. His home became a neutral ground, a place where wounds could begin to heal, not with treaties signed by pens, but with conversation shared over stew and campfires. It started small. A wounded Comanche youth injured during a buffalo hunt was brought to Bear's cabin and treated with care. Then a settler boy lost in the hills was guided back by Comanche scouts and brought to Bear's porch for reunion. Over time, Bear's ranch became known as the Crossing, a place where paths intertwined and where enemies sat side by side, not always in agreement, but often in respect. And through it all, the girl, now older, stronger, and wise beyond her years, remained by his side. She learned English quickly. Bear taught her how to plant corn, bake bread, sharpen a blade. In turn, she taught him Comanche words, songs, customs. She began traveling between the village and the ranch, weekly acting as a voice between two languages, two histories, two wounded peoples. By the time she turned 16, she was known not just as White Bull's daughter, but as the flame between nations. She translated at peace gatherings. She diffused border tensions. She calmed nervous settlers and soothed suspicious warriors. And whenever someone asked how she'd become such a voice for unity, she simply said, "A man gave me food when I had nothing. I gave him trust in return. Bear never married again. But he was never alone. The girl became his family, not by blood, but by bond." They built a schoolhouse on the edge of his property, where children of all colors learned side by side. Bear taught survival. She taught culture. Together, they taught understanding. Even after Bear passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, his ranch remained a symbol. Not of wealth, not of power, but of what could happen when a man makes one simple choice to feed a hungry child instead of fearing her. The sun rose over the Comanche village like a blessing, soft gold spilling across the plains, chasing away the darkness of the night before. Bear rode out not as a captive, but as something far rarer, a man accepted by both worlds. The girl sat beside him on the horse, no longer silent or afraid. Her head rested lightly against his arm as they passed through the land that had once whispered of death, but now hummed with the quiet possibility of peace. When Bear returned to his ranch, it was untouched a miracle, considering how close it had come to being reduced to ash. The warriors who escorted him back rode in complete silence, forming a protective arc around his land. Before leaving, one of them drove a single spear into the ground at the edge of his property, wrapped in sacred cloth marked with White Bull's own emblem. It was a warning and a promise. Any man, Comanche or settler, who crossed that line with harm in their heart would answer to the tribe. Word spread faster than wildfire through the surrounding counties. Some settlers were furious. Others were afraid. But most were simply stunned. Bear Mallister, the quiet, broad-shouldered rancher who rarely came to town, was now under Comanche protection. But Bear didn't use that protection to isolate himself. Instead, he did something no one expected. He opened his gates, not just to the Comanche, but to anyone willing to sit at the same table: ranchers, traders, scouts, warriors, mothers, and children. His home became a neutral ground, a place where wounds could begin to heal, not with treaties signed by pens, but with conversations shared over stew and campfires. It started small. A wounded Comanche youth injured during a buffalo hunt was brought to Bear's cabin and treated with care. Then, a settler boy lost in the hills was guided back by Comanche scouts and brought to Bear's porch for reunion. Over time, Bear's ranch became known as the Crossing, a place where paths intertwined and where enemies sat side by side, not always in agreement, but often in respect. And through it all, the girl, now older, stronger, and wise beyond her years, remained by his side. She learned English quickly. Bear taught her how to plant corn, bake bread, sharpen a blade. In turn, she taught him Comanche words, songs, customs. She began traveling between the village and the ranch, weekly acting as a voice between two languages, two histories, two wounded peoples. By the time she turned 16, she was known not just as White Bull's daughter, but as the flame between nations. She translated at peace gatherings. She diffused border tensions. She calmed nervous settlers and soothed suspicious warriors. And whenever someone asked how she had become such a voice for unity, she simply said, "A man gave me food when I had nothing. I gave him trust in return. Bear never married again, but he was never alone." The girl became his family not by blood but by bond. They built a schoolhouse on the edge of his property where children of all colors learned side by side. Bear taught survival. She taught culture. Together, they taught understanding. Even after Bear passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, his ranch remained a symbol, not of wealth, not of power, but of what could happen when a man makes one simple choice to feed a hungry child instead of fearing her. Let me know if you'd like to finish the story with Part 9, Final Message, or want a Vietnamese translation of this part. Bon ja nói Viet Lai phần 8 Chao Chuyen hay hon gai kan hon loi kuon hon. Bong tieng an jai ju 3100 kitu. Nard. Final message, kindness can change destiny. Humanity, even the smallest act like feeding a hungry child, can prevent war. Courage is not always about fighting, but sometimes knowing when to help a stranger. ChatGPT Jun Noi. Here is Part 9, Final Message, rewritten to be emotionally powerful, deeply reflective, and gripping with approximately 3,100 characters in English. Part 9, Final Message. Years passed, but the story of that night of the war drums that never led to war, of a child's voice that quieted 200 warriors, and of a rancher who chose mercy over fear, was never forgotten. They told it around campfires on both sides of the divide. Comanche elders would recount it during long winters, speaking of the white man who did not reach for his gun, but for a bowl of stew. Settlers passed it down to their children as a tale not of danger, but of decency. But for those who had lived it, it was not a story. It was a turning point. Bear Mallister had never meant to change the world. He hadn't set out to be a bridge, a hero, or a symbol. All he'd done was answer a cry for help, a small starving girl at his creek, too weak to speak, too proud to beg. And yet, that single act, feeding a child, shifted the course of an entire region. Where there could have been blood, there was dialogue. Where there could have been vengeance, there was vision. Bear's Ranch remained a place of gathering for decades. Its fences never built too high, its door never locked. Even after his death, the spear white bull had driven into the soil still stood weathered, wrapped in sacred cloth, a reminder that this land had once been claimed not through war, but through shared humanity. The girl, now a grown woman, fluent in both English and Comanche, revered by both settlers and warriors, continued to walk the path Bear had carved. Each year on the anniversary of the night, everything could have burned, but didn't she return to the crossing. She would sit on the old porch, light a fire, and place fresh wildflowers beneath the photograph of Bear's family. The same photo she once held up to a circle of warriors to prove that loss has no language, no border, no color. And every year when asked why she continued to come, she would say, "Because one man saw me not as an enemy, but as a child, and that saved more than just my life." The lesson he left behind was not written in law books or carved into stone. It was written in the quiet moments. The hand that offered food instead of pushing away. The arms that carried instead of condemning. The silence that listened instead of judging. In a world where fear often writes the rules, Bear Mallister broke them. He didn't change history by winning a war. He changed it by preventing one. And perhaps that is the deepest courage of all, not the kind that swings a blade or fires a gun, but the kind that opens a door when the world says to shut it. So, if you ever wonder whether your small act of kindness matters, remember Bear, remember the girl, and remember that sometimes feeding a stranger can feed hope. And hope once sparked is stronger than any weapon.